Hello, my name is Josie Barnes. I'm Anna's grandmother and Sasha's my friend, and I'm delighted to be doing this interview with them.
When were you born? In what year were you born, and what year did you leave South Africa?
I was born in July 1931, and I left South Africa in 1980, July 1980.
And what town were you born in?
I was born in a small little town in Tarkastad, but I grew up in a small little country town where we spoke mainly Afrikaans.
Our first question is, did you trust the government when living in South Africa?
Towards the end, absolutely not. I do have to explain to you guys that when I lived in South Africa, when we were younger, we weren't as lucky as you are to have the media. In South Africa, we didn't even have television until shortly before we left, and then it was very limited. Truly, I was not as aware of it until the Nationalist Party came in and apartheid became a reality. That was when it became awful. The newspapers were blacked out, so you would buy a newspaper and there would be a big black lines across because they weren't allowed to print, and all of a sudden everything was restricted and censored. And
okay, our second question is, do you trust the government more now or when you were growing up?
I did trust the government, although maybe I was a little bit different because I was involved in political groups. And so I did ask more questions than many of my friends did. I'm also a student of history, so I did ask more questions. But because it was such a closed society and we lived such a separate life, there were townships where people lived, whites lived as a group, Africans lived as a group, and only in small towns did everybody mix and live close together. But in Johannesburg we never had that. Even Cape Town was slightly different, but Johannesburg, after I was married, it was a very apartheid. Very often I think, but sometimes by choice, but I really shouldn't say that. Well, I don't think this was a true choice.
And then, do South African values coincide with democratic values?
Are you talking about the present time?
Yeah, the present time, when you've recently, or when you were, whichever you want to address, either when you were growing up or when you recently went back to visit.
Well, I must tell you, when I went back to visit, I was absolutely stunned at the country. I mean, it was just a different country.
Did it feel more democratic? Like
for
more
me,
people had a say than when you were a young girl?
Absolutely. For me, the most amazing thing was to see, when I spoke to my young nieces and nephews, the great nieces and nephews, they have never known apartheid. They didn't grow up under segregation. They're best friends, they live next door to each other, they're friends, they're always together. It is exactly,
so you
even more so than there, because the whites are such a minority.
How do you identify with South Africa?
How do I identify? As I told you, I'm so proud to be an American, and this is home for me now. But there's always something that burns in your heart.
Did you experience corruption firsthand when you were living in South Africa?
I did experience something after the years of apartheid. There was something called job reservation, where if you were of color, you couldn't be a foreman, you couldn't paint a house, and these were these amazing people, nurses my mother nursed with. These were people that grew up with my friends that I grew up with in a small town, brilliant and bright. They couldn't hold jobs under apartheid.
They were black.
They were. Well, I grew up in the Cape, so they were what was called coloured.
Okay.
So I can't talk for the Transvaal at that stage, but I'm sure it was there. That apartheid was an inhuman, ghastly government because of what they did. And what was more horrifying, the black people used to call young people boss. It's a word that said boss, which means boss. And that must have been the most humiliating. I did away with that when I was young, and we all called each other by the name. But it was that was a horrible thing that we actually witnessed.